In 1975, Michael Jackson did something so reckless, so financially insane, that Motown's lawyers swore they would bury him in courtrooms for the rest of his life. $50 million on the line, a signed contract he was about to set on fire. His own father screaming that he was throwing the family fortune into the ocean. But Michael walked into Epic Records anyway, signed his name, and changed music history forever. The question nobody asked back then is the question we're answering tonight. Why? What did Michael know that Motown didn't? What did he see coming that everyone else missed? Stay with me, because reason number 1 will make your jaw hit the floor. But reason number 10 is the secret he carried to his grave.
Even though you're gone.
Reason number 10, the royalty rate that felt like slavery in a silk suit. Picture this. It's 1975. Michael Jackson is 17 years old. He has already sold tens of millions of records for Motown. His face is on lunchboxes, on magazine covers, on bedroom walls from Detroit to Tokyo. And yet, when the royalty check arrived at the Jackson family home in Encino, the number on that check was an insult dressed up as a paycheck. 2.7%. That was the rate Motown was paying the Jackson 5. 2.7% of every record sold, split 5 ways between the brothers, then filtered through management fees, recording costs, and a maze of deductions that Motown's accountants had perfected over 15 years of doing business with black artists. Michael sat down one night at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He did the math himself. He counted the millions of albums. He counted the singles. He counted the international sales that Motown rarely even reported back to the family. And what he discovered chilled him. For every dollar a fan spent on a Jackson 5 record, Michael personally was earning less than a single penny. Less than a penny. While Gordy was building a mansion in Bel Air and buying racehorses, the boy whose voice powered the entire empire was earning lunch money. But here's what made it unbearable. Michael had watched this happen to others. He had seen Marvin Gaye fight Motown for years just to be allowed to write his own songs. He had watched men who gave their voices and their youth to Hitsville, USA, walk away with almost nothing. So when Epic Records came knocking with a royalty offer nearly triple what Motown was paying, Michael didn't see a contract. He saw a lifeboat, but Gordy didn't build an empire by letting his crown jewel walk away. And reason number 9 is where the knives came out. Reason number 9. Gordy refused to give Michael creative control, and it was breaking him in half. There's a moment every artist remembers. The moment they realize they're not an artist anymore. They're a product. For Michael Jackson, that moment came in a Motown recording studio in 1974. He had brought in a song, his own song. I need to do just something to get closer to your soul. Words he had written in a notebook he kept hidden under his bed. Melodies he had hummed into a cheap cassette recorder at 2 in the morning when the rest of the house was asleep. He was 16 years old and he had something to say. He played the demo for the Motown producers. There was silence. Then one of them looked up, smiled politely, and said the words that haunted Michael for the next 40 years. He said, "That's cute, son. Now let the grown-ups handle the music. Cute." They called his song Cute. And then they handed him a track that had already been written, already been arranged, already been decided by committee, and they told him to sing it. Smile while you sing it. Dance while you sing it. Don't ask questions while you sing it. Just be the voice, just be the face, just be the puppet. Let's dance, let's shout. Michael went home that night and cried in his bedroom. Not because his feelings were hurt, because he finally understood the cage he was in. Motown didn't want Michael Jackson the artist. They wanted Michael Jackson the machine. Every time he asked for more creative input, Berry Gordy would smile and say, "Stick with what works, son." The hits are the hits. But Michael could hear something inside himself that Berry couldn't hear. Something bigger. Something that needed room to grow. Epic Records offered the right to write. The right to produce. The right to say no. For a teenager being suffocated, that wasn't a contract. That was oxygen. But oxygen came with a price, and reason number 8 is where the real war began.
If you enjoyed this video, we invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and the real stories behind the music that built the world we live in. Don't miss the next one. We will see you there. Back to the countdown.
Reason number 8. The secret meeting at CBS headquarters that Motown was never supposed to find out about. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1975. The Blacktown car pulled up to a side entrance of the CBS building in Manhattan. Not the front door. Never the front door. The driver had been instructed specifically. Side entrance, service elevator, floor by floor up to the executive suite. Michael Jackson stepped out of the car wearing a baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes, and dark sunglasses that swallowed half his face. If anyone in the Motown organization saw him walking into CBS that day, the deal was dead before it began. Berry Gordy had spies everywhere. Berry Gordy had lawyers everywhere. And Berry Gordy had a very long memory. Walter Yetnikoff was waiting upstairs. The president of CBS Records. A man whose reputation in the music industry was equal parts genius and lunatic. Yetnikoff had been chasing Michael Jackson for almost a year. He had watched every Jackson 5 performance. He had studied every album sales report. He had done the math nobody else in the industry seemed willing to do. And what he had concluded was simple. Michael Jackson was not the lead singer of the Jackson 5. Michael Jackson was the future of popular music, period. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Yetnikoff didn't just offer Michael money, he offered him a vision. He sketched out a future where Michael wasn't competing with his brothers for studio time. A future where Michael had his own producers, his own songwriters, his own creative team. A future where Michael Jackson the artist could finally separate himself from Michael Jackson the family business. By the time the meeting ended, Michael was shaking. Not from fear, from recognition. He was hearing his own thoughts spoken back to him by a stranger. But the moment he signed anything with Epic, Motown would unleash legal hell. And reason number 7 is the conversation that nearly broke him. Reason number 7, Joe Jackson's ultimatum that nearly tore the family apart.
Even though you're gone.
You cannot understand what Michael did in 1975 unless you understand who Joe Jackson was. Joe Jackson was not just Michael's father. Joe Jackson was the architect of everything. The man who had pulled 5 boys out of a steel town in Indiana and drilled them into a hit-making machine through fear, sweat, and a leather belt that the Jackson brothers would describe in interviews for the rest of their lives.
Even though you're gone.
Joe had built the Jackson 5. Joe had negotiated the Motown deal. Joe had collected the checks. And Joe had one rule above all others. You do not cross the family business.
Somehow, some way.
When Michael came home from New York and quietly told his father he was thinking about leaving Motown, Joe didn't yell. That's what made it terrifying. Joe got very, very quiet.
Look as bad as they did yesterday.
He sat down in his favorite chair in the living room. He lit a cigarette. He let the silence hang in the air for almost a full minute.
Every minute I get stronger.
And then he said the words that Michael would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "Boy, do you know how many men would kill to be where you are? You don't walk away from Motown. Motown walks away from you." Then Joe delivered the ultimatum.
Inside. Gotta find a way.
If Michael signed with Epic, the family was done. The brothers would not follow him. The Jackson 5 would be finished, and Joe himself would walk away from his own son.
I really trust you.
Michael went to his room that night and faced the loneliest decision of his young life. He didn't sleep for 3 nights. He prayed, he cried, he stared at the ceiling.
Nothing's gonna stop me now. Gotta.
And then, on the 4th morning, he made a decision that surprised even him. He would not choose. He would try to bring his brothers with him, and the way he convinced them is reason number 6.
Even though I feel so.
Reason number 6. The brother-to-brother conversations that rewrote Jackson family history.
I don't blame it on the moonlight. I don't blame it on the good times.
Michael started with Jackie. Jackie was the oldest. Jackie was the most cautious. Jackie was the one who had been with the group the longest and had the most to lose.
Wouldn't be a bad thing, but I don't get no loving.
Michael sat down with him on the back patio of the Encino house and didn't lecture him, didn't pressure him, didn't argue. He just opened a folder he had been keeping in secret for weeks.
Just want a good time, yeah. Oh, blame it on you.
Inside that folder were every royalty statement, every accounting report, every contract clause that Michael had been quietly studying.
Sunshine, ain't nobody's fault but yours.
He laid them out one by one on the patio table. He pointed to numbers. He highlighted percentages. He walked his older brother through a tour of their own financial reality. And when he was done, Jackie sat back in his chair and said only 2 words. 2 words that changed everything.
Music grooves me, that dirty rhythm fools me.
Jackie said, "My God." One by one, Michael had the same conversation with each brother. Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, Randy, each conversation was different.
Devil's got them to me. The business.
Each brother had different fears, different hopes, different relationships with Joe, different feelings about Motown.
The funky fever, a fire burns inside me.
But the folder was always the same. The numbers were always the same. The truth was always the same. And slowly, brother by brother, something started to shift inside that house.
Nasty boogie bugs me, but somehow it has drugged me.
The Jackson brothers, who had spent their entire lives being told what to do by Motown executives and by their father, were starting to look at each other and ask a question they had never been allowed to ask.
Don't blame it on the sunshine, don't blame it on the moonlight.
The question was simple. What if we ran our own lives? But Jermaine was the holdout. Jermaine was the problem. Because Jermaine had done something that complicated everything.
Blame it on the sunshine, don't blame it on the moonlight.
Jermaine had married Hazel Gordy, the daughter of Berry Gordy, the man Michael was about to declare war on. Jermaine sat in the middle of 2 empires, his father-in-law's empire and his brother's rebellion.
Moonlight, don't blame it on the good times.
And when the moment came to choose sides, Jermaine made a choice that fractured the Jackson 5 forever.
Leave me, my baby just can't take her eyes off me.
He stayed at Motown. He stayed loyal to Berry. He let his brothers walk out the door without him.
Don't blame it on the sunshine, don't blame it on the moonlight.
The family photographs from that era tell a story words cannot. 5 brothers in matching outfits, then 4, then a missing piece that never came back the same way again.
Good times, living on the boogie.
Michael had won the brothers, most of them, but the cost was Jermaine. And the next obstacle was about to make Jermaine's defection look small.
Don't blame it on the good times, living on the boogie.
Because the lawyers were coming. And reason number 5 is when the lawsuits started landing on the front porch.
Living on the boogie. I just can't.
Reason number 5, the $50 million legal nightmare that Motown unleashed. The lawsuit landed on a Wednesday morning.
The fire inside and you do know.
The Jackson family attorney called Joe Jackson at the house and read it out loud over the phone. Joe didn't speak for nearly a minute.
That I love it. I need to do just
Then he hung up the phone, walked into the living room, and dropped a thick stack of legal papers on the coffee table in front of his son. He said only one sentence. He said, "I told you, boy," and then he walked out of the room. The papers on that coffee table represented the most aggressive legal assault any American record label had ever launched against an underage former artist.
Let's dance, let's shout, shake it.
$50 million in damages, injunctions on Michael's ability to record, injunctions on his ability to perform, claims to the rights of the Jackson 5 name, claims to the rights of every song the group had ever recorded, claims even to the right to the brothers' images and likenesses. Motown wasn't just suing Michael.
Shake your body down to the ground, let's dance, let's shout.
Motown was attempting to legally erase him, to make it impossible for him to function as a recording artist at all.
Shake your body down to the ground.
To freeze his career in a courtroom for so many years that by the time he emerged, the music industry would have forgotten his name. It was a strategy as old as the music business itself. You cannot keep an artist, so you destroy the artist instead. And Gordy had the lawyers, the money, and the patience to do exactly that.
You tease me with your loving.
Michael read the lawsuit alone in his bedroom. He was 18 years old. He had a record deal he had not yet recorded a single song for.
Body down to the ground, let's dance, let's shout.
He had a father who had told him he was on his own. He had brothers who were trusting him to lead them through a war they had not chosen.
And you do know better.
And he had $50 million in damages staring up at him from a stack of legal paper. Most teenagers would have folded. Most teenagers would have called Gordy that very night and begged to come back.
You walk around this town with.
Most teenagers would have signed any document Motown shoved across the table just to make the nightmare stop.
Shake your body down to the ground, let's dance, let's shout.
But Michael Jackson was not most teenagers. He picked up the phone. He called Walter Yetnikoff at CBS. And he said 5 words that Yetnikoff would repeat in interviews for the rest of his life. Michael said, "I'm not backing down." Fight. And in that moment, CBS Records unleashed its own army of attorneys to defend a teenage boy who had decided that his freedom was worth more than $50 million.
Shake your body down to the ground, let's dance, let's shout.
The legal war that followed lasted years, and the secret weapon Michael used to survive it is reason number 4. Reason number 4. The advisor nobody knew about who guided every single move. Michael Jackson did not fight Motown alone. There was someone in the shadows. Someone whose name almost never appeared in the press coverage of that era. Someone who had been quietly meeting with Michael for nearly a year before the epic deal was ever signed. That person was a man named John Branca. Or rather, John Branca would become that person. But in 1975, the advisor in the shadows was a different figure entirely. A man named Ron Weisner. A music industry veteran with deep connections, sharper instincts, and one defining quality that made him invaluable to a teenager about to declare war on the biggest black-owned business in America. Ron Weisner was not afraid of Gordy. Weisner had watched the Jackson 5 from the outside for years. He had seen the talent, he had seen the potential, and he had seen the cage Motown had built around them. When Michael started quietly reaching out to advisors outside the Motown ecosystem, Weisner answered the phone. And what he offered Michael was something no one else in Michael's life could offer. He offered him strategy, not opinions, not lectures, not threats, strategy. He sat Michael down and walked him through every possible scenario. Every counter-move Motown might make, every legal angle, every public relations risk. Every long-term consequence. For the first time in his entire career, Michael was being treated like a chess player instead of a chess piece.
Come on, let me show you what it's all about.
Eisner taught Michael something that would define the rest of his career. He taught him that in the music industry, information is more valuable than talent. Talent is everywhere. Information about contracts, about clauses, about timing, about leverage, about which lawyers had which weaknesses, about which executives could be pressured and which could not. That kind of information was rare. That kind of information was power. And Michael, who had spent his whole life being kept in the dark by adults who claimed to be protecting him, soaked up every word like a sponge that had been dry for years. By the time the Motown lawsuit landed on Joe Jackson's coffee table, Michael was not a frightened teenager. He was a prepared one. He knew which clauses Motown would invoke before they invoked them. He knew which precedents the CBS lawyers could cite. He knew the timeline. He knew the strategy. He knew the endgame. And he knew something else, something that Gordy did not yet realize.
1, 2, 3, baby, you and me, girl.
Michael knew that Motown had made a critical mistake in the original Jackson 5 contract, a mistake that would change the entire balance of the lawsuit. And that mistake is reason number 3. Reason number 3, the contract loophole that Motown's lawyers had overlooked for years. Every great legal battle turns on a single sentence. One sentence buried somewhere in a contract that one side wrote and the other side accepted without reading carefully enough. The Jackson 5 Motown contract had such a sentence, and Michael's legal team had found it. The loophole had to do with the definition of the group. The original contract, written when Michael was barely 10 years old, defined the Jackson 5 as a specific group of 5 specific brothers performing under a specific name. What it had not done, what Motown's lawyers in 1968 had completely failed to lock down, was claim ownership of the individual artistic identity of each individual member of the group. In other words, Motown owned the Jackson 5, but Motown did not own Michael Jackson. They owned the brand, they did not own the boy. And as long as Michael was willing to give up the name Jackson 5 forever, as long as he was willing to walk away from the brand he had spent his childhood building, he could legally walk away from Motown as a solo artist with no name-based interference at all. Gordy could keep the words Jackson 5. Gordy could keep the back catalogue. Gordy could keep every penny of the merchandise rights. But Gordy could not stop Michael Jackson from being Michael Jackson on a different record label. The brothers were a different story. They had to negotiate. They had to rename themselves. They had to become the Jacksons, plural, generic. A name that legally distinguished them from the Jackson 5 brand that Motown still owned. And every Jackson family album from that day forward would carry that scar. 5 brothers who had spent a decade as the Jackson 5, suddenly forced to record under a name that even they admitted felt smaller, plainer, less iconic. It was the price of freedom, and Michael agreed to pay it without flinching. But here's what made the loophole so devastating to Motown. By the time their lawyers realized what was happening, the paperwork had already moved. Epic Records had already filed, CBS Records had already announced. The press had already started reporting. Gordy was forced to settle the lawsuit for a fraction of what he had originally demanded, take the back catalogue as his consolation prize, and watch his greatest discovery walk out the door into the arms of his biggest rival. $50 million in damages became something far smaller, and Michael Jackson became something far bigger, free. But the moment he stepped through the doors of Epic Records for the first recording session, he made a decision that nobody saw coming. And reason number 2 is the gamble that defined his entire future. Reason number 2. The producer choice that the entire music industry told him was career suicide. Michael walked into Epic Records with one demand. One non-negotiable creative request that Walter Yetnikoff and the entire CBS executive team tried to talk him out of for weeks. Michael wanted to work with a man named Quincy Jones.
You better run, you better do what you can. Don't wanna.
To understand why this was insane, you have to understand what Quincy Jones was to the music industry in 1978. Quincy Jones was a jazz man, a film score composer. A respected, decorated, accomplished older statesman of American music. Quincy Jones was not, repeat not, a pop producer. He did not make hits for teenagers. He did not understand disco. He did not understand R&B in the way the industry defined R&B at that moment. And every executive at Epic told Michael the same thing. They said, Quincy is brilliant, but Quincy is the wrong man for this album. Michael didn't care. Michael had met Quincy Jones on the set of The Wiz, where Michael had played the Scarecrow in the film adaptation of the Broadway musical. Quincy had been the music supervisor. The two of them had spent hours after filming Wrapped, sitting in Quincy's studio, just talking. Not about deals, not about contracts, about music, about melody, about what makes a song last 50 years instead of 5, about what makes a record breathe, about what makes a vocal performance feel like a heartbeat instead of a note. Michael came out of those conversations changed. He had finally met an adult in the music industry who treated him like a peer instead of a product. And when it came time to choose a producer for his first solo album on Epic, there was no choice at all. It was Quincy or no one. The album they made together was called Off the Wall. And it did something nobody at Epic Records had predicted. It changed pop music forever. Don't stop till you get enough. Rock with you, Off the Wall, She's Out of My Life.
Be a man, you wanna stay alive, better do what you.
4 singles from one album, all hits, all chart toppers. All proof that the executives had been wrong and the teenager had been right. Off the Wall sold over 20 million copies worldwide. It made Michael Jackson the first artist in history to have 4 top 10 singles from a single album. And it set the stage for what was coming next, because Off the Wall was just the warm-up. The real explosion was still 3 years away. And it would change not just Michael's life, but the entire economy of the music industry. Which brings us to reason number 1, the secret nobody knew, the one Michael carried to his grave. Reason number 1, the vision he had at age 16 that he never told a single living soul. Michael Jackson had a notebook. A small, worn, leather-bound notebook that he kept hidden under a loose floorboard in his bedroom at the Encino house.
Then most people would turn.
Almost no one ever saw the inside of that notebook. Not his brothers, not his parents, not Quincy Jones, not even John Branca, who would become his closest legal advisor for decades.
With the practical mind.
But the people closest to Michael in his final years confirmed that the notebook existed. And they confirmed what was written inside. The notebook contained a plan.
Behind and don't like what you.
A plan Michael had written when he was 16 years old. A plan that mapped out in stunning detail the next 20 years of his career. The plan was simple in concept and impossible in execution.
There's something you should know.
Michael had written down that he intended to become the biggest entertainer in the history of the world. Not the biggest singer, not the biggest pop star, the biggest entertainer, period.
We're trying to, I'm sure they'd think again.
Bigger than Elvis, bigger than the Beatles, bigger than Sinatra. He had calculated at age 16 that to achieve this he would need 3 specific things.
You're always running here.
1. Total creative control over every song, every video, every performance, every public appearance. 2. Ownership of his own master recordings and eventually ownership of other artists' catalogs as well.
I and me, now
3, a record label partnership that would let him operate as the artist and the executive simultaneously. Motown could not give him any of those three things, not one. And so when Epic Records appeared, Michael did not see Epic as a destination. He saw Epic as a launching pad, a stepping stone. A platform from which he could eventually leap into the kind of total industry domination he had been dreaming about since he was a child watching Fred Astaire films alone in the basement. The $50 million lawsuit was not a risk to Michael. The $50 million lawsuit was a toll booth, a price to be paid to reach the road he had already drawn in his notebook years before. Every reason on this list, the royalties, the creative control, the meetings, the family fights, the lawsuits, the loopholes, the producer choices, every single one was just a chapter in a book Michael had already finished writing in his head when he was a teenager. Years later, Michael would buy the publishing rights to the Beatles' catalog for $47.5 million. He would build Neverland Ranch. He would release Thriller, the best-selling album in human history.
Most people would turn you away.
He would moonwalk on television in front of 50 million viewers. He would become exactly as the notebook predicted, the biggest entertainer the world had ever seen. And almost no one realized that the entire trajectory had been planned by a 16-year-old boy who refused to accept the cage that Motown had built around him.
If you enjoyed this video, we invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. And the real stories behind the music that built the world we live in. Don't miss the next one. We will see you there.